Welcome to Alfred Kazin Notes, a place where literature, ideas, and the minds of great writers come alive. Let's explore the thoughts behind the words.
Thank you. It's great to be diving into this one.
Yeah, so imagine just for a moment the really meticulous brushstrokes of a Renaissance master, like layering paint so thin it's virtually microscopic.
Right.
Now take that image and place it right next to a weeping biblical woman standing in a dusty first-century garden.
Okay, quite the visual leap.
It is. And finally, just to make it weirder, throw in a 1950s French con artist sneaking forged documents into a national library under a totally fake name.
It sounds like just complete chaos on the surface.
Exactly. On the surface, you have three utterly disconnected fragments of history. But when you fuse them together, you get the ingredients for one of the greatest literary magic tricks of the 21st century.
You're talking about the architecture of a modern myth. We are looking at a total cultural juggernaut today.
The phenomenon surrounding the Da Vinci Code.
Yes. But, taking an analytical, historically conscious approach, the goal isn't to simply debunk a blockbuster thriller. That's too easy.
Right. And we're doing a true deep dive here.
Exactly. The fascinating pursuit is understanding the psychological machinery beneath it all. We are dissecting how literature consumes history and how history, in turn, is perpetually shaped by our very human need for a grand, hidden narrative.
I love that. And to understand how author Dan Brown manipulated history so effectively, we actually have to start with the literal canvas, right? The visual mechanics of illusion.
We do. The sources we're unpacking highlight two foundational art techniques from the Renaissance.
And these aren't just, ways to apply paint. They really function as the perfect metaphors for how we perceive the past itself.
Let's start with the illusion of solidity, the technique known as chiaroscuro.
Chiaroscuro, so break that down for us.
Sure, so it's an Italian term, chiaro meaning light or clear, and scuro meaning dark or obscure.
Light and dark. Simple enough?
Right. But the DNA of this technique goes all the way back to the ancient Greek painter Apollodoros. He experimented with something called skiagraphia, which is essentially shadow painting.
But it didn't really peak until much later, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was the Renaissance masters who turned it into an absolute science. It is the use of intense, highly calculated gradations of light and shadow.
To create volume.
Yes. To create convincing three-dimensional volume on a completely flat two-dimensional surface.
Okay, so picture walking into the Brancacci Chapel in Florence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at Masaccio's frescoes from the 1420s, like the tribute money.
A perfect example. Because before this era, medieval religious art was overwhelmingly flat.
Yeah, the figures looked like cutouts pasted onto gold background.
They were symbols. They weren't really people.
Right. But Masaccio used chiaroscuro. He illuminated his figures from a single, consistent light source that's located outside the pictorial plane.
So you look at the heavy robes of St. Peter, and the shadows actually pool in the folds of the fabric.
The figures suddenly have mass. I mean, they cast real shadows on the ground.
Which was revolutionary. Masaccio grounds the divine in the physical world. He creates a reality that the viewer's eye implicitly trusts.
Because it mimics the actual physics of our environment.
Exactly. But then, and here's where it gets really interesting for our deep dive, Leonardo da Vinci takes this manipulation of light and pushes it past physics.
Straight into psychology.
Yes. Da Vinci perfected a technique called sfumato. The word literally translates to vanish like smoke.
Vanish like smoke. That is so evocative.
Da Vinci himself wrote that a painting should be executed without lines or borders, in the manner of smoke or beyond the focus plane.
And the physical execution of sfumato is just staggering when you break down the chemistry of it, because Da Vinci wasn't just, blending wet paint on a palette.
Not at all. Modern scientific analysis has completely blown the lid off how he did this.
Right, using X-ray fluorescence and spectrometry on his canvases. It reveals that he applied layers of incredibly thin, translucent glazes.
And we're talking about layers that were sometimes only a single micron in depth.
A single micron?
Yeah. To put that in perspective for you listening, a single strand of human hair is roughly 70 to 100 microns thick.
Wow.
So Da Vinci is applying paint at 1/100th the thickness of a human hair.
That is just insane. He would mix lead white paint with exactly 1% vermilion, which is this brilliant red pigment. And he'd layer these micron-thin glazes over and over. I mean, sometimes taking years to finish a single face.
You see this perfectly in the Virgin of the Rocks and, obviously, the Mona Lisa.
The tonal transitions are so ethereal, so impossibly soft, the human eye literally cannot detect where light ends and shadow begins.
And the theological and psychological implications of sfumato are what make it so potent for our discussion today.
Right, let's look closely at the Virgin of the Rocks.
Da Vinci entirely dispenses with the traditional hard-lined golden halos.
The ones previous artists used to essentially scream, "Look here, this figure is holy."
Exactly. Instead, because of those microscopic layers of glaze, the figures appear to be illuminated from within. Their skin is softly radiant.
And he places these softly glowing figures inside a deep, really jagged, shadowy grotto.
The contrast between that harsh, dark geological space and the internal light of the figures creates this air of profound, almost unsettling mystery.
He invites the viewer to lean in to try and basically pierce the smoke.
He does. And if you compare that invitation to what happens a century later, it's fascinating. To really grasp the subtlety of sfumato, you have to look at its aggressive, theatrical successor.
You're talking about tenebrism.
Right. Caravaggio is the undisputed master of tenebrism.
Oh, absolutely. Where sfumato relies on vanishing edges and smoky ambiguity, tenebrism is an assault on the senses.
It is the violent clash of blinding, spotlight-level illumination against pitch blackness.
Like Caravaggio's The Calling of St. Matthew. You were looking at this gloomy, dirty tavern. The background is just swallowed in pure, impenetrable shadow.
And then this single razor-sharp ray of light slices diagonally across the canvas,
hitting the surprised faces of the tax collectors sitting at the table. It is incredibly cinematic.
It forces you to look exactly where Caravaggio dictates. You really have no choice in the matter.
So tenebrism tells you precisely what the narrative is.
And sfumato asks you what you think the narrative might be.
Okay, let's unpack this metaphor, because history is almost always taught to us as if it were tenebrism.
Oh, totally.
We are handed a textbook filled with sharp lines, definitive dates, clear heroes, and obvious villains bathed in a spotlight. 1066, 1492, 1776. Boom. Fact.
But actual lived history isn't written in sharp lines. It is sfumato.
Exactly. It is layered, blurred, heavily glazed over time by memory, bias, and lost documents. The edges of truth vanish like smoke.
And that specific smoky ambiguity is what allows novelists and conspiracy theorists centuries later to hide whatever narrative they want in the hazy shadows of the past.
Because historical memory consistently blurs the lines of real human beings to create myth.
It does. The human brain completely abhors a vacuum of information, so it fills those smoky gaps with whatever the culture of the moment desperately needs.
And nowhere in the Western canon is this phenomenon more glaring than with the figure sitting near the center of Da Vinci's own Last Supper.
Right. We have to examine the staggering metamorphosis of Mary Magdalene.
So our sources include an extensive theological and historical breakdown by Father Scott Lewis, a Jesuit scholar.
And we really need to strip away the sfumato here and look at her scriptural reality versus her modern mythological status.
Because the gap between the historical woman and the pop culture icon is an absolute chasm.
It's massive. Grounding this in the foundational first-century texts is crucial. According to the historical analysis, Mary Magdalene is a figure of immense significance in the early Christian movement.
She is mentioned 12 times in the canonical Gospels.
Which, by the way, is more than most of the male apostles.
Let's establish the baseline facts from the sources. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, we are told that Jesus cast 7 demons from her.
And we need to clarify what that meant in context.
Right, because in antiquity and in modern rigorous theological interpretation, demonic possession was a catch-all explanation for severe physical illness or profound psychological trauma.
It was not a synonym for moral wickedness.
Or promiscuity. Mary experienced a profound healing, and following that, she became a fiercely devoted follower.
And crucially, an independent financial patron of Jesus' ministry.
Which is huge. Her devotion is really solidified in the narrative's most dangerous moments.
During the crucifixion, the texts explicitly note that the majority of the male disciples fled in absolute terror to avoid arrest.
But Mary Magdalene did not. She stood at the foot of the cross.
Furthermore, the Gospel of John places her alone in the garden on Easter morning. She is the very first person to encounter the risen Jesus.
That moment in the garden is incredibly intimate and powerful. She doesn't recognize him at first, right? She mistakes him for the gardener.
Until he says her name.
And she replies, Rabboni, meaning teacher. And then he gives her a direct theological mission.
He instructs her to go back to the male disciples and deliver the message of his ascension.
Because she was tasked with bringing the central message of the faith to the very men who would build the church, early Christian theologians honored her with a specific title.
Apostolorum Apostola.
The apostle to the apostles.
So we have a definitive portrait here of a woman of substance, courage, independent means, and undisputed spiritual primacy.
Yet, you fast forward to the late 6th century, and the institutional church radically repaints her canvas.
They did. In the year 591 AD, Pope Gregory the Great delivers a highly influential sermon.
And in it, he erroneously merges Mary Magdalene with an entirely different unnamed woman from Luke chapter 7.
Right, the sinful woman who crashes a dinner party at a Pharisee's house to wash Jesus' feet with her tears and dry them with her hair.
Gregory explicitly declared that the woman with the alabaster jar, the woman from whom 7 demons were cast, and Mary, the sister of Martha, were all the exact same person.
And by fusing these distinct biblical figures, Gregory saddled Mary Magdalene with the label of a penitent prostitute.
And that horrific mischaracterization became theological bedrock for over a millennium.
You can walk into almost any major European art gallery today and you will see paintings by Titian, Donatello, or El Greco depicting her as a gaunt, half-naked, weeping woman in a desert cave.
Usually staring at a skull. So why did Gregory do it? The Pope wasn't necessarily acting out of pure malicious misogyny just to silence a woman.
No, you have to look at the psychology of the late 6th century. Rome was literally collapsing.
The Lombard invasions were tearing Italy apart. The bubonic plague was decimating the population. Famine was everywhere.
The institutional church looked around at the apocalyptic suffering and needed a narrative to explain it to the masses.
They desperately needed a towering symbol of profound sin and equally profound repentance.
Mary Magdalene was simply a convenient, recognizable canvas. The church painted their own trauma over her history.
While the Western institutional church was framing her as the ultimate repentant sinner, early esoteric groups were projecting an entirely different fantasy onto her, weren't they?
They absolutely were. In the Gnostic texts of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, these are the documents discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945 at Nag Hammadi Mary, is portrayed as a semi-cosmic, mystical figure.
The Gospel of Mary is wild to read. It depicts her stepping up to comfort the male disciples who are terrified of being executed.
She essentially says, "Don't weep. I will tell you the secret things the Savior told me in a vision."
And Peter gets intensely jealous. In the text, Peter actually argues with her, asking why the Savior would speak privately with a woman and prefer her over the men.
These Gnostic texts were written by marginalized sects who used the figure of Mary Magdalene as a mouthpiece for their own unorthodox theology.
They positioned her as the ultimate insider to legitimize their specific spiritual teachings.
So the historical woman is lost twice over. Once to the Orthodox need for a repentant sinner, and once to the Gnostic need for a mystical oracle.
In that Gnostic thread, that idea of the special relationship is exactly what gets picked up, twisted, and heavily amplified in the late 20th century.
Yes. In 1982, a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail took this esoteric poetry and violently literalized it.
And then Dan Brown weaponized it for the Da Vinci Code. They transformed Mary Magdalene from a spiritual visionary into the literal biological Holy Grail.
The sacred vessel, the woman who allegedly carried the physical bloodline of Christ into France.
The irony is blinding. The historical Jesus depicted in the biblical texts consistently elevated women.
He defended the woman caught in adultery from a lynch mob in John 8.
Right. He affirmed the dignity of women and their absolute right to be instructed in deep theological truths, breaking massive cultural taboos of the era.
Yet, subsequent generations could not tolerate the blank canvas of a strong, independent, celibate female leader.
So what does this all mean for the reader? I think Mary Magdalene operates as the ultimate literary mirror. Every era looks at her and sees its own cultural anxieties reflected back.
That's a great way to put it.
The medieval world, terrified of plague and damnation, needed a symbol of weeping repentance. But our era, the 21st century.
We are deeply suspicious of massive institutional power.
Exactly. We are hungry to uncover suppressed histories. We have a driving desire for feminist theology.
So, our cultural moment needs Mary Magdalene to be the suppressed sacred feminine. We need her to be the ultimate victim of a 2,000-year patriarchal cover-up.
We reconstruct historical figures to serve the psychic deficits of our present moment. Dan Brown provided a Mary Magdalene that modern secular audiences were practically begging for.
But to transform Mary from a biblical apostle into the mother of a European royal bloodline required more than just literary imagination.
It required proof. To make millions of modern educated readers believe a conspiracy of this magnitude, the narrative required an architecture of verifiable secrets.
And that brings us to the architectural blueprint of a massive historical forgery.
Because to build a secret history, you need a secret society to guard it. This is the most audacious, bizarre chapter of this entire deep dive, the Priory of Sion.
In the mythos of the Da Vinci Code and Holy Blood, Holy Grail before it, the Priory of Sion is presented as an ancient, omnipotent secret society.
The foundational claim is that it was established in 1099 in Jerusalem by the crusading knight Godfrey of Bouillon,
And its sole monumental purpose was to protect the Merovingian dynasty.
which these books claim was the secret biological bloodline of Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
It sounds incredibly authoritative. Dan Brown even placed a fact page at the very beginning of his novel.
Right, stating unequivocally that the Priory of Sion is a real organization founded in 1099.
But the historical sources pull the rug out completely. The Priory of Sion was not founded during the First Crusade.
No, it was founded in 1956 by a French eccentric named Pierre Plantard.
Plantard is a psychological case study in grandiose delusions. He was a draftsman with a minor criminal record who spent his life trying to establish neo-chivalric orders.
To validate his own deep-seated desire to be recognized as nobility.
During World War II, he tried to start an anti-Masonic group called Alpha Gallets, which went nowhere.
But by the 1950s, he shifted his focus. He and a close associate, this aristocratic writer, with a flair for the dramatic named Philippe de Chérissé,
decided that if they couldn't join a prestigious historical lineage, they would just manufacture one.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because I have to push back a bit.
Yeah.
Calling Plantard a petty con artist or a man with delusions is like calling the architect of a casino a card dealer.
Fair point.
It completely misses the sheer obsessive genius of what he built. Plantard didn't just print a fake certificate and call himself a king.
No, throughout the 1960s, he and de Chérissé engaged in a literal covert operation.
They forged a massive labyrinthine series of genealogies, maps, and historical essays known as the Dossier Secrets.
The execution of their forgery was undeniably elaborate.
It was a heist in reverse. They didn't steal documents. They smuggled their forgeries into the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris.
They planted fake history inside the National Archives.
They used pseudonyms like Philippe Toscan du Plantier to submit these documents over a period of years, creating a manufactured paper trail that actually corroborated itself.
It was an alternate reality game decades before the internet existed.
It was a historical deepfake.
Framing it as an analog deepfake is a powerful way to understand the mechanics at play here. Just as a digital deepfake uses real pixels of a person's face to map a lie onto reality, Plantard used real historical architecture.
The Dossier Secrets claimed that the Priory of Sion and the legendary Knights Templar were actually two fronts of one unified organization.
And to explain why the Templars were destroyed while the Priory supposedly survived, Plantard invented a dramatic schism that occurred in the year 1188 at Gisors.
An event he brilliantly dubbed the Cutting of a Yelm. The details make the lie irresistible.
And the list of Grand Masters. Plantard knew that nobody cares about a secret society run by obscure French bureaucrats.
So the Dossier Secrets listed luminous, historically massive figures as the leaders of the Priory. Nicolas Flamel, the legendary alchemist.
Sandro Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance titans.
Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics. Victor Hugo, the literary giant.
Plantard hijacked the credibility of genius. The subconscious logic for the researcher reading this is, if Isaac Newton, a man of unparalleled intellect, dedicated his life to leading this society, then the society must not only be real, but it must possess profound, universe-altering secrets.
This forged framework sat like a dormant virus in the French archives until the 1970s.
When researchers who were ideologically primed to find a conspiracy stumbled upon it.
Henry Lincoln, a writer and researcher, was tipped off about these documents. He took this material to the BBC, producing documentaries for their Chronicle program.
And Lincoln, along with Michael Bajan and Richard Lee, used the Dossier Secrets as the absolute bedrock for their 1982 bestseller, Holy Blood, Holy Grail.
They treated Plantard's analog deepfake as peer-reviewed historical fact. Even seasoned documentary makers fell for it.
But notice the evolution of the narrative. Plantard's original forgery was entirely self-serving. His ultimate goal was to prove he was the rightful Merovingian king of a modern, unified Europe.
It was about French political power.
But Baguette, Lay, and Lincoln took that relatively obscure political claim and fused it with esoteric religious theories.
They hypothesized that the Merovingians were the lineal descendants of Jesus. They argued the Holy Grail was not a physical cup, but the sangreal, the royal blood.
2 decades later, Dan Brown lists this entire false architecture for the Da Vinci Code.
But Brown is a master of pacing and modern cultural appetites. He tweaks the motive.
He strips away the boring French royalist politics.
In Brown's universe, the priory's goal isn't putting a king on a throne. The priory exists to protect the suppressed sacred feminine.
He elevates a political hoax into a life-or-death battle for the soul of Christianity itself.
The hoax becomes a vehicle for modern theological rebellion. But, for a myth of this magnitude to feel real, to capture the public imagination permanently, paper in a Parisian library isn't enough.
No, forgeries can be debated. A conspiracy needs a physical stage. It needs a place where believers can travel, touch the stone, and feel the weight of the mystery.
Plantard built the paper trail, but the myth demanded an architectural anchor. Enter Rosslyn Chapel.
Rosslyn Chapel is the climax of the Da Vinci Code. It sits just outside Edinburgh in Scotland, surrounded by dense, dramatic woods.
In the novel, it is portrayed as the ultimate Templar sanctuary, a stone vault dripping with ancient Masonic codes, built specifically to hide the Holy Grail.
The descriptions make it sound like the center of the esoteric universe, but Rosslyn Chapel is a very real, stunning piece of 15th century architecture.
It was commissioned by William Sinclair, the first Earl of Caithness.
And, as the historical sources painstakingly outline, we immediately collide with a massive, undeniable timeline discrepancy that alternative historians simply ignore.
The core claim driving the tourism and the conspiracy theories is that William Sinclair was a hereditary Grand Master connected to the Knights Templar, and he built Rosslyn to house their surviving treasures.
Let's do the math on that.
The Knights Templar were aggressively and violently dissolved by Pope Clement V and King Philip V of France.
The arrests happened on Friday the 13th in 1307, and the order was officially disbanded by 1312.
Okay, 1312. And the foundation stone for Rosslyn Chapel was laid in 1446.
Right. It was built nearly a century and a half after the Templars ceased to exist.
150 years.
Medieval historians and architectural experts state unequivocally that the narratives connecting Rosslyn Chapel to the Knights Templar, the Freemasons of antiquity, or the Holy Grail have zero basis in historical fact.
It was built as a Catholic collegiate church intended to celebrate the divine office and pray for the souls of the Sinclair family.
But if you walk into that chapel today, it is incredibly easy to see why people abandon the math and surrender to the myth.
The stonework is visually overwhelming. Every single square inch of the interior is carved.
You have the famous pillars. The legend of the apprentice pillar claims that a master mason traveled to Rome for inspiration, and while he was gone, his brilliant apprentice carved a pillar of such exquisite beauty that upon returning, the master struck the apprentice dead in a fit of jealous rage.
And you have dozens of green men carved into the stone pagan faces with vines sprouting from their mouths.
The sheer density of these carvings triggers a specific psychological and aesthetic phenomenon known as horror vacui.
Fear of empty space.
Exactly. The interior of Rosslyn is visually relentless. There is nowhere for the eye to rest.
When the human brain is confronted with an overwhelming amount of unstructured, chaotic, or ambiguous data, it experiences severe cognitive discomfort.
To relieve that discomfort, the brain instinctively searches for patterns. This is an evolutionary survival mechanism. Our ancestors needed to spot the pattern of a predator hidden in the chaotic visual data of a jungle.
But in the context of a heavily carved 15th century chapel, this pattern recognition software goes into overdrive.
It's called pareidolia. You start seeing faces in the clouds, or in this case, ancient conspiracies in the stone.
Because physical spaces become texts to be read. Visitors are cognitively forced to find patterns, Masonic, Templar, or Grail related, where none were intentionally designed by the stonemasons.
For instance, theorists point to a carving of 2 riders on a single horse, claiming it is the original seal of the Knights Templar, symbolizing their vow of poverty.
But historians point out it is just a standard medieval depiction of a knight rescuing a pilgrim.
Rosslyn Chapel functions as the ultimate historical Rorschach test.
Imagine it exactly like that. We look at those intricate, ambiguous stones, and we see exactly what pop culture has conditioned us to see.
Right. If Dan Brown writes a thrilling chapter claiming a specific line of carvings represents the Rose Line leading to the hidden tomb of Mary Magdalene, millions of tourists will travel to Scotland, stare at the ceiling, and actually see a map.
They completely filter out the actual, deeply religious Catholic context of the 15th century because the modern conspiracy is just a much more intoxicating story.
It is the absolute triumph of narrative over architecture. Following the publication of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the explosion of the Da Vinci Code, visitor numbers to Rosslyn skyrocketed.
From a few thousand a year to nearly 200,000.
The physical space was hijacked by fiction. People weren't coming to see a historic church, they were coming to walk inside a novel, they were coming to participate in the myth.
This phenomenon, where the audience actively creates meaning by filling in the blanks provided by the author or the space, is not just a quirk of the Scottish tourism industry.
No, it is a deeply studied academic framework. And according to the thesis by Johanna Julin, included in our sources, it is the exact mechanical reason why the Da Vinci Code became a global obsession.
Julin's thesis explores aesthetic reception theory, heavily drawing on the work of literary scholars like Wolfgang Kemp and Hans Robert Schaus.
Reception theory.
Let's break this down without the academic jargon.
What is reception theory actually saying about how we read? Traditional literary criticism spent decades focusing entirely on the author. What was the author's intent? What was the historical context of the author's life?
Right.
Reception theory radically shifts the focus. It argues that a text, whether it's a novel, a painting, or a carved chapel, is essentially dormant. It is not a completed work of art until it is perceived, processed, and interpreted by the beholder.
The reader is the final author.
Exactly.
I think of it like a video game. The developers build the code, the graphics, and the physics engine. But the world is frozen until the player picks up the controller and starts making decisions. The player makes the world happen.
That is a perfect analogy. Reception theory posits that every text features blanks, or an aesthetic of indeterminacy.
These deliberate gaps, ambiguities, or unfinished thoughts left by the author.
And the reader is actively required to fill in these blanks using their own imagination, their cultural biases, and their pre-existing knowledge.
The friction between the text clues and the reader's active mind is where the actual meaning is generated.
And Dan Brown is an apex predator when it comes to exploiting these blanks. Let's look at how he uses reception theory in the most pivotal scene of the entire novel.
The characters, Robert Langdon and Sophie Neveu, are hiding out in the French estate of the eccentric historian Lee Teabing.
Teabing decides he needs to shatter Sophie's worldview, so he initiates a game.
Teabing really acts as the proxy for Dan Brown here. He directs both Sophie's and the reader's gaze.
He asks Sophie to look at a large reproduction of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. He asks her to identify Jesus, which is obvious.
Then he asks her a seemingly simple question. What are Jesus and the disciples drinking from?
Sophie, relying on a lifetime of cultural conditioning, assumes they are sharing a single magnificent chalice, the Holy Grail.
If you were listening to this right now and you have your phone nearby, pull up an image of Da Vinci's The Last Supper. Zoom in on the table. Look for the legendary jewel-encrusted Holy Grail.
You can't find it because it isn't there.
There are 13 small individual glass cups. Your brain simply put the Grail there because pop culture told you it should be there.
Teabing forces Sophie to recognize this. He forces her to look closer. And once her foundational assumption is shattered, he delivers the fatal blow to her reality.
He points to the figure sitting to the immediate right of Jesus, the figure traditionally identified by art historians and theologians as the beloved disciple, John.
Teabing declares it is not a man. He claims the flowing red hair, the delicate features, and the implied feminine geometry prove it is Mary Magdalene.
This scene is an absolute masterclass in manipulating perception. Brown introduces a concept referred to as scotoma.
Scotoma is a medical term for a blind spot in human vision. But psychologically, it refers to the brain's tendency to select what it expects to see and actively block out contradictory details to maintain cognitive harmony.
Teabing tells Sophie, and by direct extension the millions of people reading the book, that they have been staring at the most famous painting in Western civilization through a culturally imposed scotoma.
He doesn't just ask them to question a painting. He forces them to question the reliability of their own perception.
Brown executes this through a technique the thesis calls intra-book communication. The characters inside the story are having rigorous, pseudo-academic debates about history, religion, and art.
They are constantly blurring the lines between what is real and what is illusion.
And because the characters are doing it, it forces you, sitting on your couch reading the book, to do the exact same thing in the real world.
It shatters the fourth wall without ever explicitly acknowledging it. Brown seamlessly blends universally verifiable facts. The geographical layout of the Louvre, the actual micron-thin glazes on Da Vinci's paintings, the dense stone pillars of Rosslyn Chapel with absolute manufactured fiction.
Like the Priory of Sion hoax, the Jesus bloodline, the truth about Mary Magdalene.
By doing this, he invites the reader on a literal interactive quest.
He designed an escape room for the mind. When you read the Da Vinci Code, you aren't passively absorbing a story. You feel like you are solving the puzzles right alongside Robert Langdon.
You are actively filling in the blanks. And if we pull back the lens and look at the bigger picture, this explains something profound about our current cultural landscape.
It reveals a staggering truth about modernity. In a highly secular postmodern age, traditional religious dogma has lost its absolute grip on a vast portion of society.
However, the psychological architecture of the human mind hasn't changed.
The deep evolutionary need for mystery, for transcendent revelation, for a grand hidden truth that makes sense of a chaotic world, that need has not vanished at all.
We haven't outgrown myths. We just demand that our modern myths be dressed up in the authoritative language of our time.
We don't want burning bushes. We want cryptography, genetic sequencing, and Renaissance art history.
The Da Vinci Code provides the thrilling, transcendent dopamine hit of religious revelation, but it does so without imposing any of the moral demands, lifestyle restrictions, or institutional baggage of actual organized religion.
It is spirituality custom-built for the consumer age.
That synthesis encapsulates the overarching theme of this entire deep dive.
When you analyze the sources through the Kazin lens, you realize that the true grail of the Da Vinci Code phenomenon is not a literal biological bloodline hidden beneath a Scottish chapel.
The true grail is the chilling realization that history itself is a highly malleable, perpetually shifting narrative.
It's all sfumato.
It is. Through the sfumato of time and geopolitical trauma, the robust, dignified historical reality of Mary Magdalene was deliberately obscured and painted over by a medieval church that desperately needed a penitent sinner.
Through the sfumato of forged archives and psychological manipulation, the fictitious Priory of Sion was rendered vivid and authoritative by a man seeking neo-chivalric glory.
And through the sfumato of pop culture and the brain's desperate need for patterns, the intricate, purely Catholic stones of Rosslyn Chapel were overwritten as a Masonic treasure map.
At this point, you might be asking yourself, why should I care? Why spend an hour deconstructing the mechanics of a 20-year-old thriller, a bunch of Renaissance paintings, and a French hoax?
Because the exact same machinery is operating all around you right now.
Every single day, you open your phone, and you are bombarded with information, competing narratives, and secret histories cooked up by algorithms.
You live in an era defined by digital deepfakes, algorithmic echo chambers, and viral conspiracy theories that can alter elections.
Understanding the mechanics of myth-making is no longer just an academic exercise. It is a vital daily survival skill in the modern information landscape.
When you understand how Dan Brown utilized the blanks in our knowledge to make us co-authors of a fiction.
When you understand how Pierre Plantard weaponized our desire for hidden truths by building a historical deepfake.
When you understand how a 6th century pope could inadvertently craft a false narrative that lasts a millennium just by merging two stories, it equips you.
It helps you decode the myths that are being sold to you today. It trains your eye to recognize when a politician, an influencer, or a media outlet is applying a heavy layer of sfumato over the raw facts to guide you to a specific manufactured conclusion.
The tools of critical reception, questioning the underlying source, analyzing the aesthetic intent of the messenger, and rigorously acknowledging our own psychological blind spots and scotomas are the only defense we have against the weaponization of narrative.
And that leaves us with a lingering thought. Something for you to mull over the next time you look at a timeline or read a headline.
If a clumsy 1956 paper hoax orchestrated by a French eccentric could be amplified by a 2003 airport thriller to the point where millions of highly intelligent, educated people adopted it as absolute historical fact.
What established history that you believe today, what foundational narrative that you anchor your entire worldview to, is actually just a beautifully painted layer of sfumato waiting for someone to wipe it away.